So we have some important information to consider regarding the fixed date of 1914, along when Satan was allegedly cast out of heaven, according to Watchtower. Now we have to keep in mind these important factors. The Bible and someone's interpretation both cannot contradict each other, simply meaning either the Bible is wrong or the interpretation of the Bible is wrong, but they both cannot be right. So either they both are wrong, or either one of them is right, or one of them is wrong. And this would apply to any other interpretation that someone has that's objectively contradicting the Bible. Now, here's what we want to keep in mind. I'm not discussing regarding when the last days began. The Bible does not say that. When Jesus mentioned in Matthew chapter 24, Matthew chapter 13, and Luke 21:8, he did not say that by famines and food shortages that would mean that Satan was cast out of heaven. He said there would be the sign of the last days. He did not say anything about Satan, the devil. That's important to remember. He said nothing about the signs of wars and all that having anything to do with Satan. What was the subject matter? What's the who, what, when, where, and why, the hermeneutics of that? It's pertaining to the last days. So it's important to remember when anyone attempts to make the comparison that because the world was bad or it had its first world war in 1914, that was dealing with Satan. That means he was cast out of heaven. You can say that Satan was behind evil, but it said nothing about him being cast out of heaven. Now, this is not my main point, but I just want to reference that. Keep in mind, there were diseases, wars, way before 1914. The French Revolution, as an example, the 13 Years' War, the Civil War, and so many more. And that's just dealing with a lot of stuff in U.S. history. But think about world history all over the world. There were plenty of wars. We also have to remember Job chapter 2 and verses 1 through 5, where Satan still had access to heaven. Keep in mind when the book of Job was written. When Jesus talked about Satan in Luke chapter 10 and verse 18, I'm going to reference that. He said, I saw Satan already fall from heaven. Keep in mind, I discussed this on a previous video when you talk about present and past particles, future tenses and stuff like that. Re-educate yourself on those things if you haven't. Watchtower changed how Luke 10:18 is rendered, but actually in its truest definition is still in past tense. But in any other Bible, it's clear when Jesus said he says I saw or I watched Satan. Saw or watch is past tense. It had already happened. Now you may be asking, why is all of this important? I'm going to explain that. But here's what's important to keep in mind. We're not discussing when the last days began. The Bible does not say that. We're also not discussing when Satan came into power. We're simply discussing when Satan was cast out of heaven. Can we definitively prove that with a fixed date? Watchtower says that they have, but that's not found in the Bible. And we're going to talk about some things. Now, did Satan, when Satan was allegedly cast out of heaven in 1914, was he also the ruler of the world? At that particular point as well, when did he become the ruler of the world? Here's what's important to remember. First of all, we're going to look at when Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and Revelation, when were these Bible books completed? When were they written, and what time frames did they cover when they were written? Now, what's important to remember is 1 John chapter 5 and verse 19 says the whole world is lying in the power of the wicked one. John 16:11, Satan is referred to as the ruler of the world by Jesus. John 14:30, Satan is referred to as the ruler of the world by Jesus. John 12:31, Satan is referred to as the ruler of the world by Jesus. So in Jesus' mind, according to him, Satan was already the ruler of the world. Now, notice this about the Bible book of John, what the scholars say. The Gospel of John was written between the years 90 and 100 AD or CE. AD and CE represent the same thing. This places it as the last of the four Gospels to be composed, a generation after the synoptic Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It is believed to have been written in Ephesus, an important city in the Roman province of Asia Minor. So, John was written between the years 90 and 100 AD. Let's see what Watchtower says. In the book, All Scripture is Inspired of God and Beneficial, a book published by Watchtower, on pages 193 through 199, they say that Apostle John wrote the book of John, and he wrote it in Ephesus or near, and he completed writing it in 98 CE. And the time frame he covered was 29 to 33 CE. So we have to remember we have a cap. By Watchtower's own admission, they're saying that when John wrote that, so that means John chapter 14, John chapter 16, and John chapter 12 would have covered between 29 to 33 CE, nothing after that. So according to that alone, and keep in mind these books were written after Jesus' death, that's the time frame we covered. That's the subject matter. Jesus was referring to Satan as being the ruler of the world then. So if Satan didn't become the ruler of the world until 1914, now we have a contradiction. It's in writing. That's what time frame John covered. 29 to 33 CE. Anything after that, you can't have it 2,000 years later. So what John was writing about under inspiration, according to 2 Timothy 3:16, Jesus was referring to that time frame. So Jesus had already recognized Satan as the ruler of the world. Matthew 4:1-10 proves this. Even Watchtower was used the illustration. How could Satan give or offer Jesus something that he himself already didn't have? He offered Jesus the kingdom of the world, the kingdoms of the world, if Jesus did an act of worship to him. He couldn't offer him something he didn't have, right? That's not a real test. If somebody says, hey, I'll give you $40 million if you do this. If they don't have $40 million, it doesn't mean anything. So according to the Bible, between 29 to 33 CE, God himself recognized Satan as the ruler of the world because he inspired John to write that. Jesus himself also recognized Satan as the ruler of the world because he said it. So there's two witnesses. Matthew 18:16, Deuteronomy 19:15. We've got to have two witnesses, right? We have Jehovah God and Jesus Christ. We have three too, because John wrote that too. They all recognize what? Satan was the ruler of the world between already at that time when it was written. If he was not, that means that what Jesus said when he says Satan was the ruler of the world, if Satan did not become the ruler of the world until 1914, then Jesus Christ was lying. Now, that's still separate from when Satan was cast out of heaven, but I want to make that point. So according to the Bible, Satan was the ruler of the world way before 1914. And again, Job chapter 2, verses 1-5 was written way before 29 CE. So Satan still had access to heaven. So clearly, Satan had stopped receiving access to heaven at some point up until when Jesus came to earth, because he was already ruling over the earth at that particular time. Now, in the Old Testament, my question is, where in the Old Testament, Genesis through Malachi, is Satan referred to as the ruler of the world? All you have to do is look in look at when all those books was written in the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures. Where is Satan referred to as a ruler of the world in the Old Testament? I could be wrong. That's why I'm asking. Is there any scripture where Satan is referred to as the ruler of the world in the Old Testament? Satan still had access to heaven at that point. But guess what? In the New Testament, we have a time frame. Satan is referred to as the ruler of the world, according to the book of John. And he only covered a time frame between 29 to 33 CE. That's one thing. The next thing, let's talk about the book of Matthew. The book of Matthew was likely written between the 1st century AD. This is what scholars say, or CE. AD and CE are the same things, 50s and the 60s. Though some scholars place the date later, possibly in the 80s or 90s. Not the 80s or 90s, referring to 80 or between 80 and 90 CE. Key evidence supporting an earlier date includes the lack of mention of the temple's destruction in 70 AD in references to the Sadducees' opposition to Jesus, who ceased to be a significant force after that event. So we have either between the 80 and 90 AD or between 50 and 60 AD. Now, Watchtower says Matthew was written in 41 CE. So that contradicts what scholars say, but still is after Jesus' death. And it covers a time frame between 2 BCE to 33 CE, according to Watchtower. So they give us a time frame. So that means that everything that Matthew wrote, even about the last days, when he wrote that particular time frame, even Matthew 28, 19 through 20, when Jesus said, all authority had been given to me, Matthew chapter 28, verses 18 through 20. So he said all authority, ALL, that covers everything, right? So when Jesus said this, it would have been between 29 to 33 CE, sometime between there. So if Jesus had to wait for authority, we can quote scriptures like, sit at my right hand till God places your enemies as a stool for your feet. When did that happen? So we have to keep in mind the Bible can't contradict itself. So those scriptures were written in the book of Psalm as prophecies way before Matthew. So when Jesus said, all authority has been given me, remember Genesis 3:15? Remember that prophecy? So when Jesus died and was resurrected, presented his blood to the Father, why couldn't someone come to the reasonable conclusion that Satan had already been placed under his feet at that particular point? Because if not, when Jesus said all authority has been given to me, if Jesus had to wait until 1914, almost 2,000 years after he said that, then he did not have all authority. What does all mean? ALL, all. If he's waiting, he did not have all authority. So that's just a contradiction. That's something to think about. And what Watchtower does, by their own admission, all scripture is inspired of God and beneficial for teaching, pages 193 through 199. They place a time cover between 2 BCE to 33 CE. The book of Matthew. Matthew 28, 18 through 20. Jesus was clear. All authority has been given to me. If he had to wait until 1914 to become the king of God's kingdom, then guess what? That contradicts that. Now let's go to the book of Mark. Watchtower says on all scripture in the book, all scripture is inspired of God and beneficial, pages 181 through 186. They says that it covers the time frame between 29 and 33 CE and is completed in 60 to 65 CE. Scholars say the Gospel of Mark was this is just separate. The Gospel of Mark was most likely written between the 60s and early 70s. regarding the CE, between 60 and 70 CE. But a strong scholarly consensus pointing to a date around 70 CE, shortly after the First Jewish-Roman War. This dating is supported by the text's prophetic references to the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, an event that occurred in 70 CE. So that's just highlighting the book of Mark, another gospel account. And when you look at Mark chapter 13, when it talks about the preaching work and things along that sort in the last days, describing what will happen, again, wars were not a sign of Satan being cast out of heaven. It was just a sign of the last days, referring to whether it was at that time or if it had a dual meaning. But Satan is not mentioned as a sign of the last days regarding him being cast out of heaven. That's not in the Bible. That's something that people probably never thought about. The last days does not mention Satan as a sign of him being cast out of heaven. Read it. Matthew 24, Mark chapter 13, Luke chapter 21. You will not see anything about Satan being cast out of heaven as a sign of the last days and Jesus coming into power. Now, let's go to Luke. So all scripture is inspired of God and beneficial. Here's a main point. Pages 187 through 193. So they have the book of Luke being written between 56 to 58 CE, and it covers 3 BCE through 33 CE. So again, they got a time frame that it covers. When you think about Luke 10:18, where Luke was inspired to write after the fact that Jesus saw Satan fall from heaven. It had already happened. Saw and watched, even how Watchtower translates it. When you study the irregular verbs, the present and past particles, they try to cover it up. They add that Jesus had already saw Satan fall. It doesn't say that. It just says saw or watched. That's past tense. They try to convey like it's a future tense. But if you study past and present particles and irregular verbs, you'll see that it's still written correctly. It's past tense, but that's to confuse the reader. So the whole point is Luke 10:18, Jesus said, I saw Satan fall from heaven. So that covers a time frame between 3 BCE through 33 CE. And scholars say the book of Luke was written in the latter half of the 1st century CE, most likely between 80 and 90 CE. This dating is based on eternal evidence within the text. Its reliance on the Gospel of Mark, which dates to about 70 to 75 CE, and the fact that it describes the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple in 70 CE without recording the fulfillment of the prophecy, indicating it was written before the event. So now we have this, let's go with Watchtower's date. 56 to 68 CE is when Luke was completed according to them, but it covers 3 BCE through 33 CE. So what that means, Jesus said, I saw Satan fall from heaven. Luke 10:18. I watched him. So when Jesus said this, and when Luke was inspired to write about this some years later, the time frame he's covering, they give you a fixed time frame. It says nothing about 1914 that Jesus was talking about at that particular point. So if Jesus said, I saw Satan fall, and it had to be between 3 BCE to 33 CE that this time frame covered. So what that means is either Jesus was referring to seeing Satan fall at the latest 33 CE or sometime before that. That's the only way to look at that. That's the only way to look at that. Because if it happens after the fact, then that would make Jesus' statement untrue. So Jesus would be untrue. That would make him a false prophet, or his words wouldn't be true, and the Bible wouldn't be true either. So if that book, Luke, covers between 3 BCE to 33 CE, and Jesus said how it was originally written, I read it in any Bible, look at the kingdom interlinear, it's past tense. I saw or I watched Satan fall from heaven. Just look at the time frame. 33 CE is the cap. So either it happened at that point or before. So Jesus said, I saw him. If that's the time frame it's covering, that's your stopping point, 33 CE or sometime before that. You can't get 2,000 years later. So that would mean the Bible is contradicting itself, or a teaching is contradicting the Bible. So really think about that. I'm going to put this information in the box to reference. Now,